Good morning. Welcome to the Dean's Forum at St. John's Cathedral without a dean. I mean, he's around, he's just not here. We have a dean, he is just away celebrating his anniversary. Katie Pearson, one of the priests here at St. John's, and it is my privilege this morning to be with our amazing youth minister, Sarah Strand, and our amazing parishioner, Dan Cutler. I just said I was mostly going to be eye candy. So it's really a conversation between Sarah and Dan, and our theme today is honoring St. Francis Day. And Dan is a veterinarian at the Denver Zoo. So it's going to be a conversation between the two of them, and Sarah, who was an environmental studies major in college and a religion minor. So a conversation about how does our faith connect with the natural world. So I'm going to start out with just a couple of words about St. Francis, and I want to welcome everyone who's online. Forgot to do that. St. Francis, interestingly, is one of the most well-known and one of the most popular and admired saints, but one of the least imitated. Most of us are not willing to give up everything. So when St. Francis, who was actually the son of a very wealthy merchant of Assisi, and his father did not appreciate the fact that he turned his back on all that he had been given, St. Francis really saw a change even in the order that he founded during his lifetime, because he truly believed in this commitment to poverty and to helping those who were living on the margins. And that is a hard thing to convince a lot of people to do. So back to my first statement, most admired, least imitated. And I think one of the things, knowing that St. Francis was so involved with the poor and the marginalized, is why do we associate St. Francis so much with animals? He had a deep, deep belief that God is present in all of creation, and by taking care of creation, we move closer and closer in relationship to God. And there are a number of legends around St. Francis. So there are the stories of him preaching to birds, which he did once, and it went so well, he kept doing it, apparently. There's the story of him taming a voracious and truly man-eating wolf. For those of you, because of our proximity, I know a lot of us have been to Santa Fe. So there is a statue in front of the Basilica in Santa Fe, very famous, of St. Francis with a wolf. And that is a nod to this story. He also famously released a rabbit from a trap, again, this is legend, that refused to leave his side. The rabbit kept jumping up into his lap, and constantly, no matter how far away the rabbit was put, it found its way back to Francis. So we have these incredible stories of his love of animals and their love for him. Finally, St. Francis does not have a lot of writings, but one of the things that we still have, it's called the Canticle of Creatures. And it is one of his writings that praises God through beauty of creation, and he calls in this canticle animals, plants, elements, his brothers and sisters, the sun, the moon, the stars, fire. So he believed in living in harmony with nature, and that would bring us all closer to God. So now I'm going to turn it over to these two, because I've done like the priest part. And I think we're all in for a huge treat. Please welcome Sarah and Dan.
All right, yay. So Dan, talking about St. Francis's interactions with animals, I am curious, I want to begin where you fell in love with the animal world, and tell us a little bit about how that led you to your work.
Yeah, that's a good question there. Make sure that's working. We met about a week or so ago to kind of go through, and I appreciate that, to be able to kind of flesh this out. I think whenever I first knew I wanted to work with wild animals in some capacity or form when I was about 5 years old. I first actually blamed my grandmother because she got me some National Geographic videos with a talking animated globe named Spin. And so anytime there would be some animal statement out there and I would go and correct them, I was a very annoying little 5-year-old. I would go ahead and say, how do you know that? And I said, Spin told me, who is the name of the animated globe. So you know, somehow or other at that point I knew that I was hooked. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to do something with nature or wild animals. And from 5 years old to about 16, I had kind of gone through a progression saying I wanted to be a zoologist, a wildlife photographer, and then finally a zookeeper. And I think my whole different story, but my life growing up was very, very different than normal. Me and my family traveled all across the continental U.S. We'd be in a place for about 4 to 6 weeks at a time, and then we'd be somewhere different. So because of that, I got to see a lot of zoos. At first we started collecting shirts and we realized we did not have enough space, so it was patches and pins. And then around 16, for various reasons, I realized that I wanted to become a zoo veterinarian, which is kind of a backwards way. You should learn that you want to be a vet before you want to be a zoo vet, because it's hard to become that and you need to know that you love to be a vet. But thankfully, I liked being a vet, and I was able to keep being on to a zoo vet. So yeah.
Can you tell us a story about like one particular animal interaction that really kind of sold you, where you had a communication with an animal that really struck you and allowed you to kind of enter into the animal kingdom and understand kind of exactly like where you and another animal stood? Because, right, humans are animals too. So
Yes.
we
Well,
kind of forget that sometimes.
Well, and it's funny you say that. So I, you know, various parts, both through my training and then later on in my career, I've had students, interns, residents, training to become either just veterinarians or zoological veterinarians as well. I oftentimes will ask them and say to them just a simple question of, are humans just animals? And it's always the just, because the just is a really important word. It's not, are they? We're going to set that to the side, but it's the just. And I feel like that's an important thing, not necessarily because obviously I'm here just as a veterinarian, talking to them, training them to become what they can be, but it's important to have them ask that question. Because for me, it's asking that role of like, okay, why is it that we're doing all of these things if we are animals, which I believe we are, but if we're just animals, why are we doing it? Or are we more than that? Or are we other than that? Or how does that go? It's later on in our conversation. I don't know if I had necessarily a specific instance or animal with it. Too fun, like my hometown zoo was the Alexandria Zoo in Louisiana, and I had the opportunity to volunteer there and get to know all those animals. There was one, it was a white tiger who had arrived there, and I was there when she arrived and taking care of her for many years with that. And from then on, literally probably decades later, like a decade later, I could come by and she would spot me from a crowd. Now, I don't know if she liked me necessarily, but she knew me. She had a boyfriend named Kumar, and I don't know if she was necessarily, her name was Hannah, his name was Kumar, and I was never necessarily sure. It's like, do you want to come and see me, or do you really want to come and get me? So that's always been the thing with that, is recognizing that respect between them. So.
I'm also realizing that of the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and that I think is a nice little segue into my next question, which is, when, for you, did your spirituality and your Episcopal upbringing blend with your vocation of being a vet?
I can
and
think,
if it did.
it did and it has. I think there is. I think that there. I would say that they came about separately, although I don't think that as I was younger, they were necessarily an exclusion. It wasn't just examined. I never really thought of those two aspects of my life. Um, One funny story, whenever I was a child, my mother had Pomeranians, and we were traveling around the country, and the dog had, his name was Opie, and Opie had a limp, and so we took them into a really bad limp, didn't want to use his back leg at all, brought it into a veterinarian, they did x-rays, they took a look, and his hip was dislocated. So not a great thing for a little dog, it can be a big issue. So the vet put the hip back in place, wrapped it up in a bandage real tight to keep it in place, but had the conversation with my parents, and I was there, saying that basically, like, if this happens again, the only option is going to be hip surgery. We were not necessarily in a position to be doing hip surgery on a Pomeranian at the drop of a hat. And my dad loved my mom's dogs and everything, but, you know, said, I don't think we're going to necessarily be able to do this. And I, as a small child, heard all this and took it all in. And I took it upon myself, and I told Opie, I said, now might be a good time to take Jesus and Christ into your heart, Opie. just to be on the safe side. So that was my early St. Francis preaching to the animals. But I think later on in my life, as it came along, I did the convocation for my vet school graduation, and I think that was an opportunity for me to, it was to the entire class of many people going out to various different things in life. But I think it made me kind of think about how am I going to go ahead and phrase, all this work that we had been doing to learn to do these skills, to give them back, and to kind of connect that with my faith. And I think that as I've gone through that, I've been given the opportunity and the time to sort of examine that. I think recently I've had more chances here to sort of look into that.
Mm-hmm. We talked about last week, and it's related to this, of like, what about this, the question you said was like, that's not the important question, is what is the most important thing to do? That's not the right question to ask, is what you said. But what is important to you about working with animals and doing this specific work in particular?
Yeah, and I think to understand kind of like it's asking what seems most important work to do isn't the right question.
Yeah.
I love the questions you put forth for it. I think sometimes we get ourselves very much caught up in the fact that there are so many things to do. There are so many things going on. There are so many challenges and opportunities to give our time and to our efforts, and it can become overwhelming. I think we all face that with so many different things, and when we're looking at it in regards to the natural world, it can be the same kind of thing. And I've sometimes thought to myself, sometimes I think I have a very silly job because I'm a doctor for penguins. Like, there's so many things in my life that I could be doing to affect change, to make the world around me a better place. And I would say that that's trying to answer the wrong question, because ultimately it is very much everyone is doing their part, whether that's just in their local neighborhood, for certain aspects, for certain parts. So that's the preface for what's the right thing to do isn't the right thing. It's understanding, it's doing something. Mm-hmm. It's doing something. But in regards to the natural world and animals, this is why I love zoos, is because it gives people the opportunity to care. And I think that is ultimately the mission of zoos at the moment, is a core mission. We do conservation. We do act as an ark for animals when their environments are threatened. And we do so much good outreach, both local and international, in various capacities of what we can all do. But for me, the biggest thing that we do is whenever we have guests, and not just children. We always see the children, they always come in, but I love it whenever I see just adults coming in and loving to see the animals. So for me, I think so much of it is trying to find a way to carve out that caring, and try not to become overwhelmed with how much it is, because we could talk here all day about environmental issues going on, about habitats, about species, and that's too much. But it's too much for any of us. We had a wonderful person from the IUCN for equids, for zebras and Somali wild asses and all sorts of different wild horses, and so much work to be done, and it become overwhelming. But it is trying to see, like for us, I feel like it is supporting those groups that do that. It is taking the time to go and see nature, and also seeing the nature around us. And I think there's a question in here that I like in regard to that, so I won't go too far ahead.
I'd love to hear a little bit. You were talking about just why zoos and why we have zoos and why they exist. And I'm curious, you've said in the past that in an ideal world, zoos would not exist. And I'm curious, I want to hear you talk a little bit more about that in particular, but also in addition to what are the ethical dilemmas that you as a zoo are making to prioritize both animal well-being and also visitor experience.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it kind of, visitor experience, it's so hard because sometimes you can fall into that trap of being what zoos were, or other places which are fine, but areas of entertainment. And I think that, you know, there's no hiding the fact that, you know, zoos were just menageries. There are places for people who had the means to show off and have all these exotic animals to brag, and there was wonderment and there was awe that was inspired by that, but that wasn't the point. And I've actually asked that question. I oftentimes bring it up with our animal care specialists, our zookeepers, and ask that question, and making sure I'm not just off in left field. And they all agree. You know, we all these people were inspired by these zoos, and they end up becoming these zoo professionals because they see the importance of and the impact of it. And so much of it is I often say that, you know, if orangutans went extinct tomorrow, there were no orangutans left on the planet, here in Denver, would it make any difference, impact in our lives? Now, I would say yes, because the world would be a slightly darker place, and it would be a slightly sadder place, and we would mourn that. But the only reason we would mourn that and see the loss would be because we made a connection. I mean, at the end of the day, we are, you know, we're animals, we're souls put into these primate bodies. And so we have to understand that we have these connections. We're not living in the abstract. Or when we do, it's very, very hard, and we have these souls with bodies. And so having these connections to these animals, making them personable, making them real, is important. And, you know, I say, you know, that's the biggest thing with zoos is making people care. So in my ideal world, people would value the natural world intrinsically and recognize that we have a responsibility to take care of them. And we don't need to have a zoo to showcase that, because you're going to see the natural world around you. You're going to be able to go, you know, drive down the road and see your natural world. And you don't need to know and have met Groucho the elephant to care about things happening on the other side of the world. Because, and this is something I oftentimes think about with zoos, and it's a pitfall I think we're getting better about with zoos, is the impact. Like, it's important that we here in Denver and other places care about these other animals, but it also goes into a fact of, you know, it's not just about us. You know, it's also about these animals, but the communities that are with them. And I think that's one of the things I love about the Denver Zoo, is that we have two field conservation groups. We have International and we have Colorado. And you have to be, like, we're in such a great place to be able to help and to assist, but we have to also appreciate the natural world here. Because when we go overseas and we're helping other people, the most important part is getting them to appreciate their natural world. We take it for granted how amazing some of it is, but people come, I've had international residents and veterinarians come, and they are so excited about squirrels. You would be amazed how many people in Australia come over here and they are so excited because there's a squirrel. And so, you know, I think that's a little bit inspiring there, is that, you know, we don't appreciate squirrels. And so why should we necessarily expect them to appreciate their wildlife? And then this goes into sort of the why zoos, but what are all the other things, is understanding that there's a relationship between those animals and those communities, and we can't just solve it by saying don't hunt the animals or leave their environment safe, because those people live there. They have homes, and that is where they're, you know, raising their families and having community. And when those places, you don't have water, you don't have education, you don't have food, you don't have safety, it's easy for us to say things on the other side of the globe, but understanding that if you told me that if I go shoot that large animal with a horn and I go and sell that horn and now my family won't starve for a few years, who are we to say, no, you can't do that? So it's loving those animals, understanding that, but also understanding that we can't just love the animals. I think one of the things as we learn for people coming in wanting to become veterinarians, sometimes they'll say, I don't like people, but I love animals. And I'm always like, that's the wrong, you're not going to be a good veterinarian. So.
I want to take some time. That was, I mean, this is going to get into our next part, and we're going to split this up a little bit differently than normal in a Dean's Forum. We want to reflect these ideas back to you. Many of us have had profound experiences with non-human animals, and so I want to take about 5 minutes for you all to discuss with your neighbor, with the people around you, of a time when you had a unique interaction with a non-human animal, and what that was like for you. So yeah, take about 5 minutes to share with the people around you. On your mark, get set, go.
Together. We'll start to come back together now. Hello, hello, animal lovers. Hello, animal lovers. Okay. Hello. Someone's encouraging me to whistle. That seems aggressive. So I'm just going to share, I was saying my interaction, which I'm just going to share what Dan and I just talked about. We had in our yard, just a mile from here, what I referred to as Satan in a squirrel suit. Because every time our dog June would go outside, this squirrel would taunt her. And he was identifiable. I won't say how, but I know it was the same squirrel every time. And he would follow her. He would hang over branches and nicker at her and just make her lose her mind. He would do it from the crook of a tree that she could see from a window right inside. They are eye to eye, and oh, he delighted in it. And he threw things at me. So he would eat stuff and then throw things at me when I would sit on our back patio. And so I was sharing this with Dan, and he said, well, St. Francis would agree with you because he had mice that he was convinced were demons who would interrupt his prayer time. And so it had to be temptation in a mouse suit. So I loved all of the murmur and hubbub. Animals are definitely an important part of our lives, whether they live in our houses or outside. One of the things when the three of us met last week, we talked about that I think is often complicated for Christians as we look all the way back to the very beginning of our Judeo-Christian tradition in the book of Genesis, where God creates the animals. He has Adam name them, and then he gives Adam dominion over all creatures. And that word dominion is really, really tricky. And so I'm curious, Dan, how we reconcile or think about what that dominion should mean.
No, and this was something we had talked with and all, and I think it's a useful thing, the fact that we are in stewardship season for the church, which I understand it's a good word for that purpose and everything, but
Pledge now.
But I would say that to me has been sort of and I agree. I think it is a problem to understand our relationship with nature and to understand how important things in our lives, in our faith, in our beliefs have necessarily been used to exploit and to give reason for exploiting and why it's okay to exploit. And for me, it kind of goes back to my question that I'd have for my students is are people just animals? Because if they say that they are just animals, then why do I need to worry about caring about anything? Because why should the squirrel care about the dog, or anything else if we're just going very, very secular with it? But if we say we're not, then what does that relationship look like? And so, I think St. Francis had a lot to say and a lot to believe with that, in the sense of that kinship, that brotherhood, that sisterhood with all of nature and different animals, but also this responsibility. Because I like to ask the students, we talk about the things aren't natural, and I say, well, a termite mound is a fairly organized structure of things. So is this just a human mound that we've constructed and everything? And that's one way of looking at it. And I would say that it needs to be more, because we have such an impact and we have such an appreciation for it. But that's still that kinship. And so for me, I feel like stewardship is a better word. And I'm I'm not a Old Testament linguist here to understand with it, but for me that has felt more appropriate because it still gives that idea of the fact that we do have power, and to quote Spider-Man, with that comes great responsibility. And I think that's what stewardship is because it's not saying that we own them, that we own it. It's just that we have been gifted with the heady burden to take care, to be a gardener.
Entrusted.
Yes.
Yeah, entrusted. So the Episcopal Church on its writ large, so not just locally, has really taken to heart this idea of creation care. And you can find on the Episcopal Church website, also on our diocesan website, just an incredible amount of theological reflection, prayers for seasons. Some Episcopal churches look at this fall season as creation tide and will do special prayers and liturgies and Eucharistic prayers that are based around recognizing our intimate connection to the natural world. And it's an existential crisis on a huge level, especially when we have people in places of power who deny that that our creation is changing and that things are being harmed and probably have a bit more of that dominion mentality rather than a stewardship mentality. But yeah, I think that's an important thing for us to consider. I loved, speaking scripturally, how you referred to a zoo as an ark earlier. I thought that was awesome. So many of us find God in the awe of the natural world, and I think that's particularly true here in Colorado. Don't you agree? One of the reasons our wilderness service at 5 o'clock is popular is because so many of those folks are out somewhere enjoying their Sunday in nature. How can we honor nature and our connection to creation more fully within the walls of St. John's, do you think?
No, and I love the question of within the walls of St. John's. I mean, I think it's kind of the gospel message to take this out, go forth. And I think that's always something that we can do. I mean, I think sometimes whenever I'm worshiping, and I think, yes, there's sometimes, you're having that connection with God and the rest of the congregation. I mean, for me, sometimes I think it's also just taking that time to appreciate the natural and material world, which sounds weird coming from a church. It seems like something we don't talk about, and it's something we separate. And that's been something that I feel like as I've been trying to read more into sort of, historical connections with Christianity and nature, and how that has ebbed and flowed through the centuries, and it has not always been this dominion mindset. Like, that's not necessarily the way it's always been. And I mean, look at St. Francis. And even when St. Francis was saying the things he was saying, he wasn't necessarily it was more of the asceticism, the giving away with that than necessarily the relationship with nature. So, that relationship with nature and the material world wasn't necessarily something that's new. And so I guess whenever I say about the material world, I think it's something to appreciate and enjoy. Like, I think about the space that we have. It's amazing what we do to take care of it and be able to have that. But even just stopping to appreciate the physical material. I'm always impressed with, craftspeople or people who make things and what goes into that and how it is. And also, and I think that's one of the other things talking about nature is the balance and the cycle of it. That's one of the things that's awe-inspiring about nature is that it is not sitting still. It is a balance. It's a homeostasis, as we kept coming up with last week using all the science words. But I think having that balance is an important thing. And so recognizing the beauty of those things in our lives, that their newness, the time they're spent with us, the time the memories they make with it, that we take care of them, and also when we say goodbye to them. I think churches are a great example of things that have existed for a long time, and when they leave, people have a lot of strong feelings, which is totally understandable, but also recognizing, just in the same way with nature, of, I think I love the fact that we think about the impact that we have on the world, and also getting to think about the world in this grander scale. We get to be so small. And we get to be so small in the world and the universe and just time in of itself. And it's nice to not be that important. It's nice and sometimes to recognize it's because it's heavy to be that. So for me, I think that's one way, at least within the walls. And maybe I took it too literal, but for me, that's one of those things, because I think we have so much out and about that we can appreciate, and we should connect that. And I think when we come in here, we can see those things that are connections.
Yeah, I love the idea of reorienting yourself in the scheme of this planet, of this universe, with God, when we're in these walls, to then go out and have a more intimate relationship with nature that's not necessarily dominion, but is one where it is seeing your brother, your sister, your companion in Christ outside of these walls. Thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. Which one? Oh yeah. Yes. Okay. So we're gonna reflect it back to you guys again. And what we're curious about, and what I think should be really generative, is how does your own Christian religious identity shape your relationship with the natural world? When you go out and experience awe, what does that feel like? How does that relate to your own spirituality? And take about 5 minutes to talk to your neighbor, and then we are going to open up for Q&A with Dan afterwards. So how does your religious identity relate to your relationship to the natural world? On your mark, get set, go. Bada bum bum. That didn't quite work. That usually works with the youth group, but maybe not quite as well in the Dean's Forum. Let's come on back, finish up your last thoughts. Finish up your last thoughts. Come on in. Okay, so I just want to quickly talk about this idea that Dan and I were discussing when I took this awesome class at Sewanee called Religion and Animals. We read this book by a theologian, Donovan Schaefer, who argued that non-human animals also practice religion as well, and kind of expanding the definition of religion to being any semblance of group affect or feeling, whether that's magpies grieving over a fellow magpie or chimpanzees frolicking in a waterfall in pure delight. And so I want Dan to just share the story that you just told me about the gorillas.
So this was at another facility where I was working, and we had a gorilla who gave birth. She had a little baby gorilla, and they did what wild apes do: is they hold that animal real tight and don't want you to see anything, which makes it very hard for their zookeepers and their doctors to make sure everything's okay. And so a few days passed, and we were watching, and we could tell something was wrong. We could tell that infant wasn't doing well. So we went ahead and we immobilized, we anesthetized the mom, and we discovered that the baby was basically gone. She had passed away. And so, we made sure the mom had some health issues. There's a reason why she wasn't able to be nursing appropriately. And one of the things that we'll sometimes do, it depends on the situation, the species, but we'll bring the infant back to the group because they need that closure. And so, and we don't do this for every animal because every animal isn't the same. They need different things. But when we set the infant down, they queued up almost. One would come over and look and see what was going on. When they understood, they'd walk away, and then another would come. And the order in which it was, the understanding, kind of the processing of that, I think really reached out to me and kind of made me wonder. Something I'll often say is we talk about anthropomorphizing animals, giving human things to animals. It's oftentimes frowned upon because it doesn't make us understand. We're putting that onto them. But I think giving them that space to say, gorillas have gorilla emotions, and dogs have dog emotions, and fish have fish emotions. It's not just all about the mammals. So I know it's giving them that space to have that sacred and reverence. So.
And their own kind of liturgy is what we were talking about too. And just one last thought, you talked about how animals' orientation to God is more potentially, we can surmise this, is more immediate than what we have as humans. And just would you speak to that a little bit more about, if we're talking about non-human animal religion, what does that look like?
So I'll throw out the word that I've discovered recently in some of my reading, and it's called panentheism. It's not pantheism, panentheism, and it's this idea of that God is in and throughout and living throughout creation. And I think that I kind of push back on the idea of animals having religion, because I feel like animals don't need religion, because animals just have relationship with God. That I'll expand this beyond animals, and this gets kind of into leaning towards St. Francis, I would say, and his Canticle of the Sun and everything, is that nature itself is this expression of God. And we kind of talked about sacraments being an outward reflection of an inward truth. And I look at nature as a whole of being that joyful, awful, full expression that we get to participate in nature. So I think that, and God through nature. And so I think that whenever we look at animals, prayer we oftentimes think about as being something we speak or something we think. But oftentimes it's also the silences that we share together, and it's also the actions and the joy and the grief and the doing that we do as well. So, just going out and seeing that streaming and being in its fullness is its prayer and living to God, and seeing the animals doing what they do and just feeling that wind. I think that there is that understanding, that shared language that all of humanity can feel, and I think it's something that we relate through with nature.
Thank you so much. We're gonna open up to questions from the crowd.
This is absolutely fascinating. In the New Testament, is there an animal of importance or one that shows up more than any other?
So, is there an animal that shows up in the New Testament more than any other?
Priestly part, Katie.
I've read the New Testament once or twice, but I can't say I necessarily looked with it. I don't know if there's any that necessarily show up as importance. I think something to take note of when reading it is the language and the significance in some of those animals. I think we oftentimes talk about a dove. You see a lot of sheep out there, and you see donkeys. And I think understanding kind of the relationship that a lot of those cultures had with those animals is important. As a veterinarian, I will also sort of say, I love sheep. I think sheep are great. We're actually at Denver Zoo. We're working with, we've worked with, and we're hoping to work with more of the Dene down in Navajo Nation, the local herdsmen, their use of sheep, and also with our bighorn sheep and how those interact. I always laugh a little bit, though, because in vet school we were taught sheep were born looking for a place to die. Sheep are not the most robust of creatures. If you are in a harsh landscape, you'd much rather be off with goats. They're smarter, they get around better, which every time I think about the sheep to one side and the goats to the other, I really have to wonder and ponder. Because the goats seem a lot hardier and a lot more with it, and the sheep need a lot more help. And so every time that I think about the Good Shepherd and those lost sheep, I think to myself, understanding some more about sheep, I think I understand maybe a little bit of what kind of a flock we as humans are. So that's kind of, if I'm thinking about it, it's kind of the quintessential animal, but that's, I think, knowing more about sheep in New Testament, I would say that.
Hopefully my voice would be loud enough, but anyway. Okay. I've always wanted to hold a koala and to stand next to an elephant and just put my arms around its trunk and have the elephant do what I saw in a movie called Holiday in the Wild. I've watched it too many times. And that is, the main actor put her arm around the trunk of the elephant, a baby elephant, and then the elephant wrapped its trunk around her. And I thought, wow, what a nice hug. Is there any program at the zoo? You knew this was coming. Is there a program that allows people under the supervision of a person who works at the zoo to do those things?
No. No. We have wonderful elephants at our zoo. They're all males. They're all sometimes full of feelings as they go through their their rut, quote unquote. There are many opportunities to be closer and interact with them, and I think I love this too, because I think this kind of speaks a lot to us as we oftentimes use non-human primates. I'm going to start using non-human animals. I love that. But I would say that no, and I think that there's nothing wrong with wanting that. I think so you'll oftentimes see, and listen, I have, as a child, I think I've ridden an elephant at a zoo when they had elephant rides, and I'm pretty sure that I've had, done things that I look back now and say, that probably wasn't a good situation, either for safety reasons or for how did this come about, what's going on with the animal. But I also feel like sometimes those who care about animals and kind of know those things, one instance would be taking pictures with tigers. You'll see that sometimes at places, they have little tiger cubs and such. And I think recognizing the impulse, the want to touch and to be with, because that's the kind of animals we were made to be. We're not the turtle who wants to be off to the side. That's who we are. And I think that understanding that that impulse isn't something, it's good because we want that connection. The problem becomes is like, okay, but how does that come about? How is that safe or how is that not safe? In order for the animals to be in that situation, how does that need to come about? And that's heavy and not as much fun, and it can sometimes be, but this person over here will let me, hug the elephant. And I'll also say this is also a cultural thing because, all of our elephants are protected contact, which means we never share the space with the elephant, except in very specific situations related to certain diseases where we have to do things with them. But you go over to Thailand and to India and the mammoths and working elephants, completely different situation. They're still very big, and the relationship is different though. And so I would say no, but I would say there are ways for you to kind of come closer and get those opportunities. Go become a member of the zoo. That's my plug, Hugh. But seeing those opportunities. Yes, yes. But I would say, but yeah, so there are ways, but I think that understanding why is it that we do it sometimes and why don't we?
We have time for one more question, maybe two? Yeah.
Okay, so do you have any sense of, can it ever be appropriate for a human being to have a non-domestic pet, like a bear, a wolf, some exotic animal, or a python? Are there circumstances when that's okay, or is it something that's really should be taboo?
I'll give the very doctor answer, which is it depends. And I think that that's important to ask. There are definitely animals that I think don't need to be privately owned. There's probably animals I could argue and would be open to hearing that don't need to be in captivity. One that oftentimes comes to my mind that we as humans have tried for a long time in aquaria is great white sharks. Right? And a lot of pelagic, it means open water swimming sharks in attempts to have those animals in captivity never works. And they never last, they never thrive, they never do anything with that. I had a good friend of mine kind of half-jokingly would say I want a cougar. Can I get a cougar, Dan? And I was like, well, we're going to have to talk about your enclosure space and what kind of keepers that you're employing and your veterinary health care and all that. But beyond that, I think is the question of why do you have it? There are some great animal sanctuaries out there, and they serve a role to caring for these animals who are in situations that were not those animals' fault, but yet they are in a situation that's not ideal. They're being privately owned. Suddenly you have a tiger in your bathroom. And so those sanctuaries who can step into that role and fill those needs is so important. And that ranges the spectrum of sometimes you're meeting that role, and sometimes you're just keeping a bunch of tigers because you want to keep a bunch of tigers. And the line between filling the need that you can as far as taking care of those animals and doing it for yourself because you want to have these animals is hard to see. So I would say it depends, and it depends a lot on what you can give to that animal, and it depends on why you're doing it. So.
All right. You were talking about sharks and lions and tigers, and it's just kind of, I've been musing about in Scripture, we have these kind of negative portrayals of the predator animals. And in lots of our stories, right, there's wolves in sheep's clothing, and there's Daniel in the lion's den, and there's Samson like ripping up the lion's jaw, and there's all this kind of, there's just violence in the natural world and in Scripture. And you were talking earlier about panentheism and God being a part of all of creation, and that includes predators, and that includes violence within the natural world. And I'm just wondering, how do we reconcile God being in the natural world and the violence that is in the natural world?
Amazing question. I love it. No, and that was one of the things. Like I wanted some of these challenging questions. One of the things that we talked about as well was like, as we were talking, like we could do like 7 sessions of talking about all of it. I think that, so I wore my zebra tie today, and I also have a matching zebra pin, but I chose not to wear it today. I have a lion up here. And I think that I love it, nature documentaries. That's 5-year-old, that's where I learned to love animals. But sometimes on those nature documentaries, there's the gazelle who's being chased by the predators. And we have this idea of that we want to know who's the villain and who's the victim and who's the hero. And how do we fit that into it? It's a nice, simple way for us to categorize what is happening. But we've gotten better. I don't like saying but we've gotten better and showing things of understanding, like that cheetah who didn't catch that gazelle, now there's a bunch of cute, adorable cubs who are going to die because they don't have food. They're not able to nurse. And so the question of violence, pain, suffering, there's a lot of those things, yes, we can go ahead and put at the feet of humanity and try to address. But this ball has been spinning for a long, long time before we were necessarily affecting things. We would have people bring baby squirrels to the hospital in Louisiana, the vet hospital. We had 400 squirrels brought in a 24-hour period because a hurricane hit, they all fell out of the tree, and people brought them. Now, hurricanes have been hitting the Gulf Coast for a long, long time, and squirrels have been falling down, and all the other animals just call that second breakfast because look at all the food that just, the manna from heaven. But manna from heaven. But I think that does speak to something. I waited till Katie left. that does speak to something about the problem of pain, and how do we as people, as humans, as Christians, deal with bad things happening in our life, in the world, to us, to the people, for no apparent reason that we're trying to see. And just in the same way, kind of wondering about, nature as sacrament of something outward, reflecting something inward. I don't necessarily know, I haven't figured it out of an answer, but I do think it provides an opportunity for reflection about that. And I think that thinking about creation and nature as this balance, this relationship, this dance, maybe gives a little bit of perspective in our lives about those things. And I've had this discussion with other people about thinking about violence and what violence is and what it means. and how it's for us personally, but what also it is just in general. And so I think nature gives an idea of how do you view that. It's not an answer, but typically I don't necessarily trust someone who says, here is the answer, and we've gotten it. So, yeah, thank you.
Let's give Dan a major round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We have our Blessing of the Animals service today at 3 p.m. For those of us who are joining online for the Dean's Forum, please join us for the 10:30 service online as well. And with that, thank you and go in peace.